A hero is defined by the adversity he must overcome, and that has never been more true than for Spider-Man, who has the greatest collection of foes of any modern hero. We are going to set up our Spidey villain shelves, from the legendary to the hilariously inept. Hey y'all, welcome back to Carbon Scoring, the best place for comics, history, and action figures. With all the great action figures that have come out over the past few years, I've been going shelf by shelf and rearranging my Marvel Legends displays. But this time, it's Spidey's turn. No, not the man himself, but the characters who define him, his villains. In this video, I'm going to set up 3 new displays with over 60 unique characters in total. For years, I have used this shelf to display my 90s animated 5-inch figures from Toy Biz. It is a great and colorful collection, one that has unique characters that haven't been released in the 6-inch line. But it's a little cramped, and it's time to change things up. So what are we going to do with this space? Well, it turns out the answer is pretty easy. Steve Ditko and Stan Lee teamed up to create the Amazing Spider-Man and the foundation of his Rogues gallery over the course of only 41 comics, from the premiere in Amazing Fantasy 15, then 38 issues of Amazing Spider-Man, along with 2 annuals. We are going to celebrate the unrivaled creativity of that 3-year period with our first villain shelf. In Spidey's first appearance, he didn't face off against a world-conquering supervillain, no. It was a simple burglar who changed the course of Peter Parker's life. We are 60 years overdue for a figure of this pivotal character. The Webhead quickly got his own title, and in the first issue he encountered the Chameleon. This figure debuted in the 2015 Rhino Wave. But there was another long-standing foe, perhaps Spidey's most persistent nemesis, who premiered in that issue, J. Jonah Jameson, seen here from the Retro Card series of 2020. Vulture appeared in the 2nd issue of Amazing Spider-Man, and we got this relatively recent Marvel Legends figure, which is really good. It's got a dedicated head sculpt that captures his character, and these sweet wings really work. But he's on the exact same body as Spider-Man, and, for me, that's just not gonna cut it. The Vulture was all about contrast, the elderly winged villain versus the teenage hero, and Toy Biz captured that with this hunched-backed sculpt from 2006's Fearsome Foes box set. It still hasn't been topped. Arguably the greatest nemesis from Ditko's era was Doc Ock, who first appeared in the 3rd issue. I'm still using the 2018 SPDR figure because I cannot for the life of me get the new bendy wire tentacles to properly port into a different body. Sandman was the main villain that Spidey faced off with in issue 4, and this new retro card back, to me, even when you add in the sand accessories, it's just a little bit too plain, a little bit too boring for such a dynamic character. Now, the Diamond Select version came a little bit closer. I think you get more of that personality to the face on this one, but it's still just not quite right. The Build-A-Figure Sandman is an absolutely fantastic action figure. I mean, just look at the detail and everything that goes into these sand sculpts. This head with the impact crater and him screaming is phenomenal. But this isn't how Ditko drew Sandman. That's why I'm picking the 2004 Spider-Man Classic Sandman from Toy Biz. He's the proper scale, he has a very ugly Ditko-esque face, and he even has a sandy sculpted texture to him. It's just a great figure. After an appearance by none other than Dr. Doom in issue 5, in issue 6 we see the first appearance of the Lizard. Now, this Build-A-Figure Lizard is pretty terrific. I mean, it really brings out that reptilian, almost dinosaur-like nature, but it's way, way too big to be a Ditko Lizard. For years, I went with this version, this old Toy Biz version, much smaller, much more Ditko in scale. I love the tattered, dirty lab coat on this one and the overall grime of this figure. But since then, we've gotten the most definitive Ditko Lizard possible. The 2022 Retro Card Lizard came with a tongue-flicking head, but it was this head that looks like it leapt off the page of Ditko's earliest drawings of the character. Combine that with a bendy wire tail, and this one makes the shelf. Issue 9 saw the first appearance of perhaps the most outlandishly costumed character to date, the enigmatic Electro, one of the earliest retro-carded figures from back in 2020. With the 10th issue, Spidey faced off against the first of many gangsters he would battle over the years, the Big Man. But he didn't come alone. His henchmen included the appropriately named Ox, who provided the muscle for the group, while being a little short in the brain department. Speaking of short, the diminutive Fancy Dan relied on his fighting skills, having been trained in judo to be a persistent pest to the wall crawler. And finally, the cunning cowboy Montana, who uses his skills with a lariat to counter Spidey's web shooters. Together, they were the Enforcers, the first group of baddies the web spinner ever had to face. Mysterio is arguably the Ditko-iest of all of the Ditko villains. I mean, these gauntlets have so much like Doctor Strange vibe to them, and the way that he was able to use the dome of Mysterio's mask in so many ways in his art, it just really does bring out all of his style. But this original figure was like really dark. The green on green with the purple backdrop just doesn't really bring the flair that Mysterio really needs, but luckily, we've had an improvement. In the form of this 2020 retro cardback release. While Ditko's Mysterio was colored more like the previous version, there is so much green in this early Spidey Villains display that the brighter colors and yellow gauntlets are a welcome addition to our shelf. I've done a complete history of Green Goblin action figures, and earlier this year I did a review of Mezco's Silver Age Gobby figure, which is truly great. But still, nothing tops the original Marvel Legends Green Goblin from the Toy Biz Onslaught wave all the way back in 2006. Making his first appearance in issue 14, this figure perfectly straddles the Ditko Ramita art styles. Kraven first appeared in issue 15, and it's taken a few tries to get his action figure right, although this first one from Toy Biz was pretty close. I mean, that is such a great head sculpt, and the combination of the leopard print with the lion's mane and the zebra bracelets really captures that, African hunter vibe. He was repainted with a screaming head that was not an improvement. Now, more recently in the Hasbro Marvel Legends line, we got a really great Kraven figure, lots of detailed sculpting on this one, but again, he's just really brown and kind of washed out, and that doesn't have that 60s vibe of those early comics that Ditko drew. So thankfully, the retro card line comes through again, repainting the figure we just saw in bright 4-color goodness. This is the Kraven that leapt off of the comics page. Scorpion first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man issue 20, and since this one came out in the Spider-Man Classics line, it has been my go-to Scorpion, even though it really doesn't have much Ditko style at all. These rivets seem to indicate that he's wearing some kind of armor plating, and the fully open face mask is from a much different era than the original Ditko style. Now, we got a newer one that did have the closed face mask, so that's certainly closer to the way that Ditko drew him, but there's something about this metallic green that just never has really matched up for me. But luckily, the new animated retro cardback line solves several of these problems. It's not perfect. The face mask is open around the mouth, and dare I say it, the bendy wire tail is actually too long. But for sheer pop art color explosion, this is the Scorpion that's going in the display. Issue 25 of Amazing Spider-Man is an all-time classic, where JJ battles Spidey in the first of the Spider Slayer robots. Friend of the channel, Martin Dallard, made this custom Spider Slayer for me. He is a brilliant metalwork artist and is as big a Ditko fan as I am, so I've got his info in the description if you want to see more of his fantastic work. The Crime Master was another of Ditko's street-level gangster villains. While his story was short-lived, his legacy lives on in this custom figure from my display. Molten Man kind of felt like oh yeah, let's just throw him into this Amazon 5-pack just for funsies. And while I've been screaming for more color and more dynamic looks, for Molten Man, this just seems a little bit over the top with how yellow this kind of golden color is. Plus, these fire accessories really don't fit. He's made of molten lava. He melts through things because of his heat, not because he's actually firing off flame. So for this one, I gotta still kick it old school. With this custom Molten Man that I've had for years, Liz Allen's stepbrother Mark Raxton truly looks like he has had a metallic alloy grafted to his skin with this unique paint scheme. Alright, the gang's all here. Let's set them up. Gotta save a little bit of room for the Ditco villains that we're still missing. The Tinkerer, Living Brain, Looter, and a classic Beetle. Okay, that's one shelf down, 2 more to go, and still plenty of Spidey villains to go around. If the Ditco villains were S tier, then this next shelf would constitute an A-list rogues gallery for any other superhero character. Let's take a look. I got back into Spidey comics when Todd McFarlane joined the title on issue 298, and by 300, he had given us the most definitive Spidey Foes since the Ditko days with Venom. I chose this version as it best represents Venom's appearance in those early McFarlane issues. Jazzy Johnny Romita took over the art duties with issue 39 and immediately made a name for himself introducing the Rhino in issue 41. This Build-A-Figure version from 2015 is still the gold standard for Rhino figures, and updates Romita's art with a modern twist. Romita's next major contribution was the Shocker, and while he may be best known for having his tail handed to him by a symbiote-possessed Spidey in the animated series, he is actually one of the Web Slingers' oldest villains, dating all the way back to issue 46 from 1967. Gangsters have been a staple in Spidey's Rogues Gallery from the very beginning, but none have had the oversized impact of the Kingpin of Crime. This retro card version replicates the pop art colors and style of his original appearance in Amazing Spider-Man issue 50. John Romita Sr. is credited with this one, but it has long been rumored that his son actually came up with the design for the Prowler when he was just a kid. Either way, the future Spider-Verse villain made his debut in issue 78. The Beetle actually started out as an Ant-Man villain. He even appeared in the early Ditko issues, albeit in a different costume. Here, he is presented in his most classic look from the 70s and 80s. Hobgoblin will always hold a special place in my heart, as he was the bad guy in the very first Spidey comic I ever got, Amazing Spider-Man issue 250. And while there have been numerous versions that have come out since, I always come back to the Spider-Man Classics version from Toy Biz, as it perfectly captures the John Romita Jr. art when I first met the character. Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz had a legendary run on Amazing Spider-Man in the 1980s, introducing several new characters, including the Puma, a Native American superhero named Thomas Fireheart, who first appeared in issue 256. DeFalco and Frenz also added Silver Sable to the Spider-Man mythos in issue 265. The Symkarian mercenary and leader of the Wild Pack would go on to vacillate between friend and foe in the Wallcrawler's personal circle. Yet another gangster was introduced during this time, the Rouges. DeFalco initially intended his secret identity to be Roderick Kingsley, who was later revealed to be the original Hobgoblin, but eventually he was found to be the Kingpin's son, Richard Fisk. Initially just a throwaway character, Spidey's former professor Miles Warren would create long-lasting havoc and devastation in the web spinner's life by being the catalyst for the Clone Saga as the Jackal. When Spidey got a second monthly comic book title, The Spectacular Spider-Man, back in 1976, it was none other than the Tarantula who graced the Sal Buscema drawn cover. As Mark Bagley continues to climb the Mount Rushmore of Spidey artists, he's drawn more Spidey comics than anyone else in history. It seems only right to include his most famous addition to the Spidey mythos, Carnage. It didn't take long after the comics code was revised, allowing for more supernatural characters in mainstream comics, for Roy Thomas and Gil Kane to introduce Morbius the Living Vampire in Amazing Spider-Man issue 101. As one of the newest creations on this shelf, J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr. brought us Morlun, the Hunter of Spider Totems, back in 2001. It speaks to the strength of storytelling in the Spidey books that so many of these characters who started out as foes became allies of the Wallcrawler, none more so than the Black Cat, who definitely moved Peter out of the friend zone. Jessica Drew's comics origin has been retconned so many times I can't keep it straight. Hydra, Skrull, whatever. Her real-world origin is she was basically created to establish a trademark and keep the distinguished competition from making a Spider-Woman. Julia Carpenter's Spider-Woman, on the other hand, debuted in my favorite comic series of all time, Marvel's Superhero Secret Wars. And when drawn by the graceful pen of Mike Zeck, it's good stuff. But nobody brings a crew together like a blind, osteoporotic, paralyzed, telepathic, precognitive mutant, Madam Web. I still haven't seen the movie. Let me know in the comments if the Sydney Sweeney scenes are worth the effort. Alright, we have everyone we need for our second villain shelf. Let's start getting them in place. time for my absolute favorites, the C-list villains who keep the Spidey books fun and unpredictable. No one has as many of these guys produced in action figure form as Spidey. Let's start with one of my all-time favorite action figures. J. Jonah Jameson's astronaut son, John, found a mystical ruby on the moon, transforming him into the lunar-powered man-wolf, perfectly captured here by Toy Biz in the Spider-Man Classics line. During the aforementioned DeFalco Friends run of the 1980s, there was a brief time where both Hobgoblin and Green Goblin were out of the picture, leaving an opening for another Halloween-themed villain, Jack-O-Lantern, my favorite third-string goblin. If the Enforcers and the Sinister Six are the premier group Spidey has had to face, the Sinister Syndicate certainly belongs on this shelf. In addition to Beetle and Rhino, the group featured the lightning-fast Speed Demon. Our next Sinister Syndicate member is Boomerang, who was recently Peter Parker's roommate in the comics. Awkward. Here he is shown in his modern costume. I'd love to see a classic version. Rounding out the Syndicate is Hydro Man. This version really seems to lean into the art style of Eric Larson. Hydro Man has actually had 3 unique action figures in the 6-inch line, which realistically is way more than he deserves. Speaking of third-rate goblins, I'm not even gonna try to explain the comics history of Demogoblin. Let's just say it's very 90s. That said, with his flaming glider and tattered demonic costume, he does make for one good action figure. Daily Bugle reporter Ben Urich's nephew, Phil, also took on the Goblin mantle on several occasions, all with varying degrees of failure. However, this Build-A-Figure as Phil as Hobgoblin, which is based off the art of Humberto Ramos, is certainly worthy of display. In 1984, Marvel ran an event called Assistant Editors Month. See, all the regular editors were in San Diego for Comic-Con, and they left their assistants in charge. Hilarity ensued, and that month's issue of Spectacular Spider-Man had him facing off against the Human Fly, as drawn by noted cartoon artist Fred Hembeck. Comics used to be really fun. Another attacker from the air is the newest Beetle, this time inhabited by Janice Lincoln, the daughter of the mobster Tombstone. Like her dad, she's trying her hand at organized crime. Wait, did I mention mobsters? From the earliest days of the book, Spidey has faced off against gangsters and mobsters, and since there can only be one kingpin, somebody's got to fill up the C-list, which is where Tombstone comes in. But he's not alone. Silvermane heads up the Italian Magia, not to be confused with the real-life Mafia. I'm sure Stan Lee wants no part of that action. He's an old man in a cyborg suit that's run by pasta. I'm just kidding. Please leave my family alone. Hammerhead is called that because his skull has been replaced with a steel alloy. Being unable to work as a radiology tech, he turned to a life of organized crime, enforcing his will by battering things with his head. Can't make it up. And completing our triumvirate of racial stereotyping, the Asian gangs are led by Martin Lee, who goes by the name Mr. Negative. He did come in a 2-pack with one of his goons, and if you bought a bunch of them, you could fill out his gang with all the extra heads. Hey, maybe Hasbro are the real mobsters. Yeah, I know, Stiltman isn't really a Spidey villain, but where else am I gonna put him? He actually first appeared all the way back in 1965 in issue 8 of Daredevil. But he did face off against Spidey in issue 237, which featured this freaking fantastic Frank Miller cover. I really should try to replicate this one with action figures one day. Just like our other 2 shelves, this one contains some custom figures. First up is Cardiac. I love this dude's design. And his backstory is that he's a surgeon who fights against the corruption of Big Pharma. Sounds like a hero for our time, if you ask me. You know him from across the Spider-Verse, but before he went all Hollywood, The Spot was a hilariously third-rate villain in one of the secondary Spidey books. The fact that someone saw past that and realized the immense power of this character is pretty great. If the Punisher is an A-list mercenary and Silver Sable is a B-lister, then that firmly places the Paladin on the C-list, right where he belongs. Okay, now it gets really good. Who had Razorback gets a Marvel Legends figure before Rocket Racer on their bingo card? Sure as hell not me. Alright guys, you've opened this door. Let's see Grizzly and the Hippo. One of the most well-executed action figures in my collection. White Rabbit is an absolute treasure. Everything about this figure is perfection, from the fuzzy boots to the kink in her bunny ears. Just gorgeous. And yes, I could not love Frogman any more than I already do. Another character I was introduced to in 80s Spidey comics, Eugene here hits the sweet spot between sincere and absurd, and I'm all about it. Alright, the goofballs are all here, let's make them sing. There you have it. Over 60 unique Spidey rogues across 3 displays. I really tried to use the comics history as the basis for setting up these displays. How do you think I did? What would you have done differently? There are still some figures that I didn't include, but don't worry, I've got plans for them. This was an insane amount of work, but also a ton of fun to do. Thanks to everyone who supports the channel and makes this possible. And as always, for the best in comics history and action figures, subscribe to Carbon Scoring.